trying to sort of capture what these experiences actually are, and found, not surprisingly, that Muslims have sex in ways that are not sanctioned by sexual ethical frameworks or legal frameworks. And so I think it raises a really interesting question about the production of normative discourse and its relationship to sexual practices. So what happens when Muslims don't care anymore what their sexual norms are, their religious sexual norms? Then what? Do the norms then have to change? Do the practices have to be policed more? So I think there's a really interesting sort of tension here. And Hart has, in their publications, including in this book, argued that experiences matter, that we can't just dismiss them as not normative and not Islamic, and then just move on and insist on the norms themselves. The inclusion and justice piece, one of the sort of tensions that produces in their own work, so I said earlier they're queer inclusive, but they also maintain that sex is only allowed within marriage, which means that they then need to think about different marriage models, right? So like we need to consider what happens when it's not heteronormative marriage. So do we need a wider marriage model, or is the idea that queer people are not allowed to have sex because they can't get married? And so that's one of the sort of tensions in their own work, where they run up against some of these principles in sort of the practical application. And then that relates clearly to the question of inclusion and justice. So affirming a spectrum of gender and sexual identities beyond heteronormativity, and also taking the idea of justice as a Quranic principle, as an Islamic principle, and then arguing that the stifling of sexual practice for people who don't fit into heterosexual marriage produces certain kinds of harm, and that's a reason not to prevent it. And then lastly, Hart and many other Muslim organizations, I think, both build around the notion of justice, but also around the notion that Muslims are here in this world in order to change society, to make it better. So the idea is not to maintain, but to actually change. That then explains their advocacy work. Okay, almost done. So I have two endings for this talk, because I couldn't decide which way to end it. One is a quote that I want to read to you from Keisha Ali's very, very important book, Sexual Ethics and Islam. It's specifically from the second edition, 10 years after it was originally published. She republished the book in 2016. And instead of sort of updating the whole book, she decided to write a coda for every one of the chapters. So at the end of every chapter, there is this sort of like, here's what's happened in the last 10 years. And in chapter 5, which is called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, at the very end of the chapter, she says, whatever forms of relationship Muslims engage in, the task is to ensure that long-term partnerships, erotic entanglements of shorter duration, and loving relationships, both sexual and platonic, contribute to, rather than detract from, human flourishing. For that flourishing to be not just worldly, but afterworldly as well, those relationships must be acceptable in the sight of God. What I and others propose is that in thinking about God's guidance for human interactions, we think less about the who and more about the how of ethical relations. And you might have noticed, so I picked this idea of human flourishing for the title of my talk, and want to maybe leave you with thinking about what this question of less of the who and more of the how of ethical, and she means here sexual relations, as one sort of ending to the talk. But there is a second one that is a sort of late addition. So I'm currently working with my colleague Sama Chaudhry on the mountain of editing work that it is to put a volume like this together. So it's forthcoming in the sense that we're hoping to be done by the fall. It's going to be an open access volume because we wanted to make sure that many different kinds of contributors could participate in the project. There are 23 from, I think, in all 7 different countries. It focuses on sexual violence in Muslim minority communities, and it's going to be open access so that everyone can see it and read it. And it seemed like a really important sort of dimension to this work. And one of the contributors to the volume is Mariam Bikan, who is a medical professional in South Africa, who wrote this chapter that I put here, Vaginismus and the Muslim healthcare professional. And it was really editing this just 3 or 4 days ago, copy editing it actually. It's a very powerful chapter that talks about the experiences of women who have vaginismus in South Africa and their experiences with Muslim healthcare providers that didn't take their concerns seriously. And so what she develops from, and she describes that as a form of sexual violence, that they're not taking these concerns seriously and actually do harm to their patients. And she ends with a call to Muslim healthcare providers who she recognizes often have an investment in Muslim or Islamic frameworks to provide care to their patients ethically and to consider the potential harm of gender biased and patriarchal interpretations that they claim to be the only interpretation. So, in summary, everyone needs to look up what HEART is doing. They're amazing, and it's actually kind of hard to paraphrase the work that they do. And to come back around to the question in the beginning about sort of the universality of sexual ethics, if I had to answer the question, I would say there are aspects that I think that we share all as human beings. I'm very invested in the idea of harm reduction or harm prevention as a measure of whether sexual ethics work or not, especially bioethical framework. And I think we need a lot more work and a lot more brilliant minds to come up with a somewhat unified Muslim feminist sexual ethics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hamad, for a very interesting and stimulating presentation. Now I will open the floor for discussions, questions, comments.
Thank you very much. That was great. I'm Robert Klitzman from Columbia University. You mentioned at the beginning that there was a lot you did not understand. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what the pieces that you don't understand are. Though I think you said about this area of, I don't want to call it feminist Muslim bioethics, but sexual ethics among Muslim women, or perhaps I misunderstood what you were saying.
Is it? Yes, now it is on. Okay, it was already on. Sorry about that. So no, I meant the bioethics part is not something. So like when I got the invitation, I had to look up what bioethics really actually means. It's a little embarrassing at this Congress, but still. So that's what I meant.
Okay. So another question, if I may. You're looking at Muslim women in the U.S., and I'm wondering how much are there? I assume there's similar issues with Muslim women in other countries where Islam is in the majority, and are there similar challenges or groups like yours, or how far a leap is that?
So I think in Muslim majority countries, first of all, they're all very different from each other, right? So like every country has its own sort of set of concerns and issues, and the way Islam, so to speak, is involved in statecraft, in the legal system, differs really widely from not at all to at least as a claim exclusively. So I think that's important, and I think if we think about the question of authority, so Sunni Muslims don't have a sort of hierarchical religious authority structure, at least not a formalized one, but of course some people know more about Islam and have the authority to interpret that other people might not necessarily have in that same way. And so I try not to end up with the US is really great for Muslims to do their interpretation thing, because anti-Muslim hostility and racism are very real as well. But there are ways in which Muslim feminist activists, let's say in Egypt, for example, or in Pakistan, are in a significantly different situation in terms of the spaces that they have for having those kinds of conversations. And so it is a bit of an apples and oranges kind of a thing, I would say. And if you're interested, the organization to look at is Musawa, Muslim international, a global Muslim organization that works on equality and Muslim family law, that does that work very interestingly situated in particular contexts.
Any further questions or comments? Yes.
Good afternoon, and then thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for your wonderful presentation. I'm Aissatou Danka. I'm a bioethics student from the Gambia. It has been very interesting. And I also come from the part of the world where we face a lot of ethical issues when it comes to reproductive justice. The country I am from, the women, are faced with a lot of problems, like they have to fulfill their marital obligations, and then at the same time fulfill the religious obligations. And then let's say in a day, a woman will be faced with a lot of house chores to do. You have to run the family affairs. You have to go pick your kids from school. You feel very tired, and then at night, your husband will want to approach you for sexual, pleasure also. And then if you happen to deny, religiously, you are being quoted. It's not accepted in Islam. And then here, at the same time, you also want to fulfill your marital obligations. So as an experience, you said when it comes to bioethical issues, you are not that much experienced. But I just want to hear your opinion regarding this ethical dilemma that these African women are usually faced with. So what will be your opinion in some of the things that they will do when they are faced with such type of a problem, where you have to fulfill your marital obligations, and at the same time, you also want to observe your religious, obligations too. Thank you.
So I think one of the things that we see happening is that the religious and the marital obligations are mapped onto each other, right? So the idea that women, once they are married, are obligated to have sex with their husbands when their husband wants to have sex is represented as a religious obligation that is connected to the hadith about the angels cursing until morning. And we see that in all kinds of Muslim community contexts. So like in this, the people who are contributing to the sexual violence in Muslim communities volume, many of them talk about these very questions. And so I mean, I think what organizations like HEART are trying to do is to say that's not the only interpretation. You can't just give people a hadith and say, this is what it means, because it means different things. And sometimes, well, there's a whole debate about whether hadith are reliable and who decides whether they're reliable. I think it would be really interesting to create a collection of patriarchal hadith that support a particular patriarchal interpretation, and then look at why those are always emphasized, right? Like why is it not different ones? So I think engaging simply by saying, okay, there is a different set of possibilities. This isn't the only interpretation. And then recognizing, I mean, that's why I think these principles that HEART came up with, especially the one about mutual sexual pleasure, creates an understanding of sex within marriage that's not hierarchical, where the man has the right to have sex and the woman has an obligation to have sex. It shifts the understanding of the purpose of that as strengthening the relationship between spouses. And there's several contributors in the volume that are from South Africa, which is a really interesting context, right? So like it's in a context where there is recognition that gender-based violence is very, very present in South African society. And we see Muslim minority communities push back against some of the religious interpretations or support for gender-based violence, right? And so I don't have a short answer. I think it is about breaking open the monopoly of this is what Islam says about something. And if you want religion to inform marital sort of ethics, to say that doesn't mean there's a singular answer just because men have answered that question over the past 800 years or 2,000 years in that way, that's the only way to answer those.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Joanna Smolensky. I'm a professor at Baylor College of Medicine and also an ethicist. One of the things that I was really interested in your talk was especially sort of coming from the previous panel where there was a talk about kind of the moral status of the embryo and sort of how it's kind of unimaginable, right, for there to exist an embryo without there being both, you know, a male and a female who have kind of equal access to the creation of an embryonic product. And you speaking to the fact that this organization is not only feminist in nature, but very sort of queer inclusive. I was hoping to just hear a little bit more about that queer inclusivity, because this sort of idea that, you know, what it would look like to have a feminist sexuality in the context of Islam is not just sort of sex positivity, right? But that there is a lot of space for a kind of a different approach to sexuality that just isn't sort of permissiveness, right? But then if you have jurisdictions where, for instance, queer marriage is not legal and marriage is a prerequisite to sexuality, well, then what does a queer sexuality look like in Islam? I was hoping to hear a little bit more about that in the context of this project. Thank you.
So I think that's what one of the things that I was flagging was that if the basic principle is sex only within marriage, then the next step is going to be thinking about what Islamic marriage could look like, right? And there are, I mean, there are reasons other than queer inclusivity for why that is an important question to ask anyway. Keisha Ali in Sexual Ethics in Islam points out that queer inclusiveness, which she has sort of tended towards since the book was originally published in 2006, would mean a different marriage model. There are others, including Asafa Qureshi, who is the legal expert for the Sex Talk book as well, who has argued that we would basically need a different idea or a different understanding of Islamic marriage as not inherently patriarchal and hierarchical. Because if you had, say, gay marriage, for example, there is some scholarship on how to make Islamic marriage models work for people who are have same-sex desire. But of course, there's also an enormous body of work that ironically is also coming out of the US Muslim context that is pushing back against any kind of queer inclusion. So you're right that there would need to be a different marriage model if we insisted on the marriage part. Keisha Ali's quote, I think, is not necessarily pointing only in that direction. So I think she would go farther than the heart advocates in saying it's about being ethical when you have sex, which includes consent and not harming the other person, and less so about marriage. I will say that even heart that is insisting on sex within marriage, but is also queer inclusive, has faced enormous backlash from more conservative Muslims in the US context, all the way to basically being declared not properly Muslim, and anyone who's associated with them some people who are associated with them. I'm not prominent enough for that to be an issue, but there have been other scholars that have been attacked just for their association with heart. And so to me, over the past decade that I've been sort of working with them, it's been really interesting is a weird word, but painful and interesting to see how much they want to reach every Muslim. And at the same time, the stance of being committed to the ones that are most marginalized also pushes them away from the sort of imagined mainstream. And so it's actually in the sex talk book, in the introduction, it's kind of heartbreaking to see how they're trying to say, but you have to see that this is the ethical way to do it. We can't not be queer inclusive, but we also want to be recognized by people who will reject us because we're queer inclusive.
Well, if there's no further questions, I just want maybe to add that there are some like especially in Arab countries, there are movements toward like more open sexual educations from a Muslim perspective. Like there are like famous, I think, physician in Egypt called Ida Qutb, which is very popular on social media, on TV. There's also Shireen al-Fiqhi, who wrote a book called Sex and Citadel, talking about the post-Arab Revolution movements of like openness to discuss issues related to sexual ethics, sexual education, and all these aspects. Okay, well, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Rushan Iqbal, who is an associate professor at Agnes Scott College, Atlanta, and department chair and director of Middle East Studies. Her research interests include gender and sexuality in the Quran, Islamic law, film and media studies, and modern Muslim intellectuals. Her last book, as far as I know, is Marital and Sexual Ethics in Islamic Law, Rethinking Contemporary Marriage. And I think she's going to present part or like part of this book. So the floor is yours.
I would like to start by thanking both the organizers that are in front of us and those that are behind the scenes, and especially Dr. Samar Rashwani. I recently took my students to Morocco, and the local co-lead told my students that the highest sharaf in Islam is generosity. And we have definitely felt the generosity and hospitality of Qatar. So we thank you. I refuse to proceed like Dr. Hammer as if it is a normal day in a normal time, especially at a bioethics conference, especially one held for the first time in a Muslim country without mentioning the harrowing genocide that is taking place in Palestine. As academics and as Muslims, we have failed our people. I consider myself first and foremost complicit in what is taking place. To my topic, today I'm going to talk about reimagining marital, sexual, and reproductive ethics through challenging muta temporary marriage. Usually, when I present in Islamic studies conferences, people do know what muta or temporary marriage is. But just quickly, I can answer more questions about it when we are in the Q&A. But just quickly, it is an institution that Shia Muslims practice. And even within Shia Muslims, only the 12ers practice it, not the 7ers and the 5ers. It is an institution where a man, he can be single or married, can marry another woman, but the woman must be single, so she cannot be married for a prescribed amount of time. So the formula for the marriage is that I, X-man, marry you, Y woman, for 3 days, 3 months, 99 years, for X amount of dowry. So that it's a very simple formula. You can read it, and then you're married for that time. So the topic of my talk today is reimagining marital, sexual, and reproductive ethics through challenging muta temporary marriage. In his famous book, The Jurist Primer, the jurist and philosopher Ibn Rushd wrote that the purpose of Islamic law is to cultivate al-fadl al-nafsiyah, the virtues of the soul, alongside ibadat, ritual practices, and what he called al-sunnah al-karamiyah, the norms of dignity. Ibn Rushd pushed us to contemplate what he called the norms of dignity and brought the conversation about Islamic law back to ethics and morality. In my paper, I asked the question, how can we determine whether muta is permissible or not if the verse or ayah 424, historically used as a proof text, cannot give us a definitive answer? And related to this are additional questions. Is it possible to do this while constructing our argument from within the Islamic legal tradition and centering marital, sexual, and reproductive ethics? What are the consequences of muta for Muslim women, children, and the family structure? Does permitting sex outside of permanent marriage change the nature of marriage, nature of Muslim marriage and Muslim sexual landscape? Does allowing muta as an assisted reproductive technology tool redefine the meaning of family and nasab? And what moral and legal implications may arise from this shift? Muta, temporary marriage, has been a source of controversial debate throughout history. The polemical nature of this debate has created a liminal space, making it an excellent subject for reconsidering and reimagining marital and sexual and reproductive ethics. This paper posits a reassessing and rethinking of the conceptualization of sexual, marital, and reproductive ethics within the interpretation of muta in particular and within Islamic law in general. It proposes one such path by considering moral questions on the issue of sexual ethics and marriage. The question of the permissibility of muta is entangled with important moral questions. Although there are several questions and my list is not exhaustive, I will address 8 key questions of morality in this paper. The analysis presented here, as well as the work that still needs to be done, have serious implications for issues related to modern sexual relationships, marriage, and Islamic sexual ethics. Many legal historians and scholars have argued that moral considerations inform Islamic law and cannot be discussed independent of it. According to Mudarrisi, engaging in broad moral discussions is necessary not only for establishing a legal moral theory, but also for answering essential human existential questions. Mudarrisi discusses the questions pertaining to moral and legal philosophy in his 3rd volume of Al-Tashfir al-Islami. According to him, moral philosophy has 3 main values: love, justice, and life. Mudarrisi argues that theology, morality, and law are one regenerating body where each one supports the other in turn. In this paper, I raise the question that aims to create a link between moral philosophy and various legal implications. Although some of the moral considerations that underlie early fiqh or Islamic law do not fit our modern sensibilities, here I try to speak directly to some contemporary moral considerations. I must begin this by mentioning that I am not a trained moral philosopher. My shortcomings notwithstanding, I advocate that in the context of debates regarding the permissibility of muta, moral and socio-moral questions should be addressed alongside concerns related to marital and sexual ethics. Here I present some of the many questions we can consider in order to start the conversation. The answers classical Muslim jurists provided to questions about sex and morality contain profound contradictions that are resolved using a variety of legal structures. Jurists allowed concubinage or extramarital sex with enslaved women, which was, in most cases, presumably non-consensual, while simultaneously punishing adultery and rape. The Shia allow muta or temporary marriage while prohibiting casual sex and prostitution. Some of these contradictions survive because historically the male elite had control over the law and value-making process. However, this is not the case anymore, and the system bears rethinking. The question of the permissibility of muta is entangled with important moral questions. Although there are several questions and my list is not exhaustive, I will address 8 key questions of morality here. First, is sexual activity connected to a Muslim's spiritual well-being? Posing these questions allows us to consider the spiritual impact of the body, the spiritual impact the body has on the soul, as opposed to the conventional frameworks that examine the soul's impact on the body. If the answer is yes, then it seems reasonable to conclude that sexual activity should not be bought or sold the way it is in Mutta. But if sexual activity does not have spiritual significance, if it is similar to being a sales clerk or a typist who both get paid for their services, then Mutta may be faultless. While we know that nakedness during sexual intercourse is physical, psychological, and emotional, the question here is it also spiritual? In other words, can humans sell or buy or voluntarily partake in sexual activity without it affecting their spiritual being? Is transactional sexual intimacy somehow different from situations where we sell our labor as part of an economic transaction? Studying sexual objectification is an important development within sexual ethics, and it acknowledges that the bodily nature of sex is morally significant. We should continue the trend and develop richer understanding of the bodily experience of sex and its spiritual significance. The second moral question I ask relates to the concept of consent and sex. Muslim Jews deem a marriage legal when ijab or consent is given by both the man and the woman. Feminism and moral philosophy have long tried to complicate our understanding of consent, its nature, when it's present and absent, and its ultimate moral force. In many cases, some individuals cannot give consent. Therefore, it is too simplistic to only refer to consent when dealing with questions related to sex and morality. Other factors might play an essential role, and other deliberations must be considered. Basically, we need to move beyond the legal idea of consent as a yes or a no and look at the moral question of if and when consent is possible. For example, moral philosophy tells us it is important to ascertain when yes actually means yes than when no means no, because ascertaining a no does not provide us with information about situations where a yes is given. We have some indication in the Quran that it acknowledges that not everyone can give consent. So if we look at chapter 24, verse 32, which commands those with power over enslaved women to not force them into the act of adultery with other men. Therefore, we need to think of consent as a moral question, and not just as a legal one. Feminists further the discussion of consent by adding to our thinking two factors that we must think about more. The first is coercion, both direct and indirect, and the second is competence. Why? First, because consensual but unwanted sex often harms a woman's autonomy in more subtle ways than rape, assault, or harassment. Second, sex can be misleading because some of the physical actions of sex appear to convey trust, affection, care, and sensitivity alongside enjoyment and pleasure. And this is morally consequential. For example, our war widows and financially strapped poor divorcees, and these are the ones, we have very little data on Mutta marriages, but the data that we do have shows that it's war widows and financially strapped divorcees that partake in Mutta do so without any coercion, including monetarily. Are they able to give consent to Mutta? If the state provided for them, would they partake in this type of marriage? However, when asking these questions, I do not want to undermine the need or desire for sex by these divorcees or single women, and the satisfaction and pleasure associated with it. Moving on to thinking about competence, a young woman who might not be able to, who might not be aware of the physiological effects of sexual intercourse on their physical and spiritual being able to give consent. This, alongside moral and feminist interventions, can be our entry point into thinking about consent and developing a morally strong standard for it. The third moral question I look at looks at the ethical questions around casual sex and associated values of abstinence. Casual sex in the West largely escapes moral notice, nor does it raise much, if any, disapproval. The position that Mutta is permissible matches up well with the casual sex model. The intentionality behind most temporary marriages is generally directed towards the pursuit of casual sex. A recent article from the Modern Love series in the New York Times presented the story of a white mother who approves of the Mutta between her 13-year-old sexually precocious daughter and a Muslim boy from a religious family because it allows the boy to have sex with her daughter in a way his Muslim parents found acceptable. This article highlights something Muslim scholars have mentioned in reference to muta. It allows Muslims to engage in casual sex while feeling like they're still abiding by the moral dictates of Islam. Muslims and almost anyone with access to Western media are confronted with images and discussions of casual sex in popular culture in a manner that undermines any notion of the virtue of abstinence or sexual restraint. Behind this is is the role of what feminists have called the presence of compulsory sexuality. And I think Rasia Zakaria was also referring to that, and Dr. Hammer referred to her. In society, and some problematize the easy formula of sexual activity equating to liberation. We know that some Muslim feminists approve of muta because it takes away the stigma of virginity, and religiously sanctioned sexual exploration has liberatory potential. However, moral philosophy challenges the idea that the manifestation of positive feminism is the enjoyment of multiple sexual partners, and that sexual empowerment is synonymous with empowerment in general, arguing that the concept of compulsory sexuality helps us pay attention to the limitations of viewing sexuality as a path to liberation. Just as the concept of sexual empowerment is debated, abstinence is certainly one of the most maligned and misunderstood virtues in contemporary culture. The word often evokes connotation of inhibition and prudery. But abstinence does not eliminate one's appetite or passion, it moderates them, enabling them to be informed by prudence, in this way used for the true good of the person. If one has to be sexually active to realize one's full personhood, then abstinence appears perverse and any form of sexual restraint suspect. This is especially true in a culture that views sexual expression and pleasure as integral to personal health, happiness, and fulfillment. And if sexual expression is not necessarily limited to marital relationships for it to be seen good, then even the notion of abstinence can be seen as arbitrary and oppressive. As we heard earlier, sex indelibly affects individuals. Two people might look at casual sex as a passing indulgence, but its consequences are unpredictable. Neither knows what reactions it might produce, what desires it might arouse, what needs it might reveal, and what harm it might cause, especially in the case of women who have a different physiological experience of sex than men. Also, what was intended as a momentary gratification may prove to have unforeseen emotional repercussions and cause unexpected suffering or unhappiness. Although sex should be enjoyable, it does not exist solely for the sake of pleasure. The obsessive focus on bodily pressure often spirals into blank effacement of all things spiritual and noble. Kierkegaard notes that despite the novelty achieved from experiencing an array of partners through casual sex, life ultimately succumbs to a cycle of sameness. A good sex life cannot be achieved solely through physical gratification from multiple sexual partners. It must be wrung from the mundane nature of life and marriage. Multiple partners should not be shied away from simply because of a diminishing return of satisfaction. Even if it is enjoyable and relatively satisfying to engage in casual sex with multiple partners, it nevertheless might be morally problematic. Satisfaction can also be gained from refusing to jeopardize another person's moral and emotional security. A second problem casual sex creates is the erosion of discipline to be faithful within a marriage. Having never practiced abstinence, an individual might miss the variety of sexual partners or have difficulty remaining faithful to just one partner. And the type of life monogamous marriage affords, creating a whole host of other problems. Morally speaking, casual sex is altogether too much of a risk, especially since it's merely for occasional momentary satisfaction. This is one of the strongest moral arguments in favor of abstinence. The fourth moral consideration tries to focus on children's rights and child welfare issues stemming from the effects of multiple intimate relationships within family spaces. There are two types of children that require our moral consideration. First, the children who exist within permanent marriages, whose fathers, and like I mentioned, mothers cannot engage in muta marriage while being in a permanent marriage, a double standard that is part of a different discussion, are partaking in temporary marriages. Second, children conceived through temporary marriage, I regard it as given that parents have a duty to protect their children from abuse and neglect, both physical and emotional. I also realize that what counts as abuse or neglect can be different in moral and legal spheres. Legally, a man is allowed to partake in muta while being married and having children. And it is sometimes difficult to determine like what harm is because the age and gender of the child might be different and affect the child differently and may even change from context to context. So for example, familial or geographic context may be a factor in determining abuse or neglect. Also, I assume that if parents fail to promote a child's interest, harm, sometimes lasting a lifetime, is caused. Questions about questions about how muta affects children and what kind of moral neglect takes place due to it have never been formally considered. But to help us determine the permissibility of muta, they need to be addressed. One factor that separates muta from prostitution is that children produced within um, these marriages are considered legitimate in Islamic law, historically an important consideration within Muslim societies, and they have inheritance rights. However, no formal legal setup exists to make sure these children do receive their inheritance, nor is there a legal setup for monthly child support. Does the father participate in any child rearing activities when there is no formal legal requirement? And how does such an absence affect the child? Here I'm concerned with the moral responsibility of caring for the emotional well-being of children produced through permanent and temporary marriage. We must seriously consider actions that might place innocent children at risk of harm or neglect. Keeping children safe from harm is not simply a matter of physical safety. Unless children are given continuous and positive attention, there will be harm. This stewardship conception of parenting places a complex moral status onto the parents. This status involves two main factors: the rights of children and the needs of children. Parenting is thought of as a relation of care, advocacy, protection, and much more. Will we find that muta leads to parents being less caring and insensitive to the dependency and vulnerability of their children, given the importance of what is at stake, both for the lives of our children and our society at large? The protection of children in our care is a matter of much moral significance. Therefore, I suggest thinking about our relationship with children as a moral one and not just as a biological one, encouraging a kind of appreciation for the moral meaning associated with bringing children into the world and the role of the family. Marriage is a complex institution with layers of moral, social, and legal relations. Our fifth moral question asks if there is a morally ideal form of marriage. Is it monogamous? Is it polygynous? Is it polygamous? Is it polyandry? Is it temporary, etc.? In the American context, some Black Muslims see polygyny as a way of preserving Black community. Distorted gender ratios due to male incarceration, discriminatory education structures, and underemployment have detrimentally affected Black marriages. And polygyny represents a practical way of providing women with husbands and fathers for their children. Similarly, Sabah Mahmood has shown in the Egyptian context, some women choose polygynous setups and find it fruitful. In contrast, India and China have more men than women due to large-scale selective abortions of female fetuses. But this has not led to the invention of a tradition where one woman is allowed to marry several men or where several men choose to marry one woman. I mention this to point out the role of patriarchy and gender discrimination in making it easy to see some purpose or usefulness in polygyny. More often than not, contemporary polygyny is accompanied by sexist culture and theology, hierarchical power relationships, and significant poverty. For our purposes, then, traditionally conceived polygyny is more objectionable when it precludes genuine equality between spouses. The genuine equality I mentioned is not a present-day ethical ideal for marriage, but something the Quran requires for polygynous marriages, and poignantly points out that it is most likely that a polygynous marriage is most unlikely to achieve it. The most obvious issues with polygyny are gender discrimination, whereby men marry multiple women, but women may not marry multiple men, possible child neglect, and sometimes the coercion of women. Even if women are not physically forced into polygynous marriages, they might feel familial, religious, or economic pressures to enter them. I recognize that these faults are not necessarily specific to polygyny. Some of them can and do exist in monogamous marriages, but here my concern is temporary marriage, which is a type of polygynous marriage. The correlation between polygyny discrimination, and abuse is seriously troubling, but the underlying causes are difficult to define. Instead, my core argument is that traditional polygyny perpetuates an inequality that directly affects women and children. However, I'm also uncomfortable with accepting that by default, lifelong monogamous marriage is the institution that can be best adapted to serve the interests of society, families, romantic partners, and children. And this is in part because of its association with Christianity. At the very least, we can attempt to move beyond framing polygyny questions as good versus bad and engage in a pragmatic assessment of whether polygyny might be regulated to be consistent with contemporary conceptions of equality and fairness in family life. Rethinking Islamic law in this context can ameliorate the power and bargaining disparities in multiple marriages in gender. Our sixth moral question stems from thinking about the feelings of women in polygynous relationships. What are the moral implications of the negative feelings women in such relationships might have about each other, about themselves, because they are co-wives? Indeed, there are some polygynous relationships where women are involved, where the women involved love each other and are like sisters, and others where women are bothered by each other and so are negatively affected. Here I want to ask how I want to ask how ideas about the other wife or wives' desirability, beauty, strength, success, or a host of other things can unnerve these women. In particular, some of the feelings I want to think about are envy, jealousy, passive or active rivalry, anger, maternal jealousy, sexual jealousy, and rivalry, among other things. These feelings are produced in women and caused by men when they simultaneously marry multiple women. What is the moral weight of these negative emotions? Who should be held accountable for this moral weight and suffering? And how should we account for the complex emotional life polygyny produces? Should questions about the effect of this type of marriage has on emotional lives of women also enter into the conversation about the moral acceptability of temporary marriage? Some people might criticize me for essentializing or adhering to stereotypes about women, but I'm not claiming that all women necessarily feel this way. We do know that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wives ended up dealing with some of these emotions. So given that for Muslims, he is a perfect example of a human being, we must seriously consider that if the Prophet Muhammad's peace be upon him was not able to have a tranquil household without jealousy and strife between his wife, then we are likely not able to do so either. We must account for the grief, misery, strife, and lack of well-being felt by these women. I do not necessarily want to promote monogamy here because I do not think it is perfect or without flaw. Rather, I simply want to point out the moral issues related to polygyny. Monogamy is by no means perfect, but morally speaking, it is less treacherous, and it is simpler to work towards justice and equality within it. The next moral question under consideration um, is the question about a Muslim's body. Is a Muslim's body at their own disposal? Can they do with it as they see fit? We can sell our kidneys or liver, but is it the same as selling sexual services? Is it morally permissible to profit by allowing one's body to be used to satisfy someone else's sexual desire, like in most muta marriages? In other words, is it morally permissible to make oneself an object that someone else can use to satisfy their sexual appetite, just as one satisfies their hunger with a burger? A narrow and traditional conceptualization of muta views it as one person, woman, surrendering to another, a man, solely for the satisfaction of his sexual desire. When a person is used as an object to fulfill a desire, that desire is directed towards sex and not towards the person as a human being. The muta contract deals with the enjoyment of a part, not with the entire person, not with the entire being of the person. However, there is another way to view muta, through mutual desire and consent. Perhaps both parties are satisfying their mutual desire for sexual satisfaction. Perhaps both persons are satisfying the desire, and there is no gain in this relationship. It is only for mutual satisfaction. Except for the question related to moral harm, there appears to be nothing morally contemptible about contracting a muta if there is reciprocity and consent. But one consideration remains, whether it is disliked by God because our bodies are ultimately vessels that God created and should be treated with care. This is similar to the Kantinian view that even if there is consent between two individuals, this sexual activity is not morally permissible if they are using each other as means and not as ends. If giving into sexual desire does not involve immorality, then anyone can engage in sexual intercourse and make whatever use they want to of their body. If sex outside marriage is unobjectionable, Muslim scholars allowed concubinage, then there is no harm in muta. But if extramarital sex is objectionable and violates moral dictates, it follows that there should be conditions outlining where sex is not in line with morality. There must be a moral principle that serves as a foundation for restraining our freedom to exercise our sexual impulses and restricting our use of our bodies. The eighth and final, I'm at the final moral question, pertains to how muta is utilized to gain access of third-party surrogacy. It allows a couple to use donor embryos, which are inserted into an infertile woman, or even a surrogate. Here, muta also prevents accusations of inappropriate sexual behavior and guarantees the child's lineage, even if scholars ultimately disagree about which woman is the mother. Using muta to address infertility can be complicated. The process is simple if the wife is the one who's infertile. However, if the husband is infertile, the process is a burden for a woman. Islamic law does not allow a woman to have more than one husband at a time, permanent or temporary. Women can still contract a muta, but they must first divorce their husband, observe a waiting period of 3 months, then contract a muta with a sperm donor. Once the predetermined period of the muta comes to end, the wife must observe another waiting period before she can remarry her original husband. However, the child belongs to the temporary husband according to Islamic law. Thus, the woman and the donor must sign a separate agreement that grants the custody of the child to the permanent husband. Despite their desperate pleas, contemporary scholars refuse to give a verdict favoring women and thus allowing them to bypass this long, circuitous process. In 2 of Makram Shazi's ruling, addressing donor semen, he remains firm that children should be produced only within the bound of religiously sanctioned marriage. He does not invoke applicable juristic principles like zarura, necessity, or adam al-harj, protection against distress and constriction to offer an alternative solution. My end got deleted. But basically, so these, it's not on my, so basically these are some of the questions I think would be interesting in terms of sexual ethics to think about in temporary marriage. But temporary marriage just allows us a space to do so. These are questions we should think about in general. Because temporary marriage happens polemical, it allows that space for me to be able to ask these questions.
And then Lika, now Fitzia.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Florencia Luna from Argentina. Thank you very much for this very, I don't know, different kind of presentation. I didn't know, and I didn't knew before that there was this possibility of temporarily marriage. So I'm absolutely ignorant. So my first question will be how frequent this is, where it happens the most, or what are more the empirical data that you can let us know, or at least to me. And also, what happens with the woman once that this temporarily marriage finishes? Because one thing is if you say, well, for 1 weekend, well, maybe nothing. But also if we are thinking, as the previous presenter was saying about abstinence and all that, well, what are the repercussions for her? So she was married, she's a divorcee, what is her status? Is she welcome in the community? I don't know, millions of questions.
No, I think, I mean, obviously, like I mentioned, usually when I present, I'm presenting an Islamic studies conference and everybody does know what temporary marriage is. So it was my failing that I didn't mention in detail what temporary marriage is. It's just that I didn't have that much time. But just to quickly, so there are two types of marriages in Islam, permanent marriage and temporary marriage. So permanent marriage is a polygynous marriage where a man can marry 4 women at the same time. In a temporary marriage, you can actually be married to 4 women at the same time in an unlimited number of temporary marriages. But like I said, temporary marriage is only allowed by Shia. So there are two major sects, Sunnis and Shias. Shias about 20% of the Muslim population, and within them, only the 12ers allow. So the three types of Shias, only the 12ers allow temporary marriage. And as for what happens, so there are lots of similarities between temporary marriage and permanent marriage, but there are also a lot of differences. So the similarities are that there is a formula. So in a permanent marriage, the formula exists, and in temporary marriage, the formula exists. In a permanent marriage, you're required to have witnesses, but in a temporary marriage, you're not required to have witnesses, which you can imagine then it lends itself to a lot of abuse, right? Because how am I going to claim I was temporarily married to X, Y, and Z? With the advent of, you can do genetic testing. So if I had a child and the person I was temporarily married to said, this is not my child, in previous times, they would either go to someone who would like look at the facial features and say, this could be the child of this man. Or if this person said, no, this is not, then you were like, left with a child, with taking care of the child. But now with genetic testing, it can be proved who is the father of this child, and then that father has to provide for the child and give inheritance rights to the child. Your question was about divorce. So there's in a permanent marriage there is a divorce, but in a temporary marriage, the unceremoniously the marriage just dissolves itself. So when the time period ends, the marriage ends, and there's no. In terms of the stigma attached to a woman who partakes in temporary marriage, so temporary marriage is practiced in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And it's not something that is socially acceptable as such up until recent times, and I'll get to that. But prior to recent times, it was more something that was practiced by women who were marginalized. So it really, I don't want to say, because I think it's problematic to say that it was legalized prostitution, but it was not, it's different and similar to it. Different in the sense that if she did have a child, the child would have inheritance rights, right? But similar in the sense that it is only a transaction where we both agree that you're going to pay me $2,000 or 2 billion would be nice. And then it's going to be over, right? And usually these women partake in many temporary marriages because this is how they are providing for themselves. And did I answer all of this? Yeah. In recent times, it's interesting, since Ayatollah Khomeini came into Iran, he kind of inserted temporary marriage into the school curriculum. And like I grew up as a Shia in Pakistan, and I didn't know about temporary marriage till I came to the US and someone kind of mentioned it and it blew my mind. I'm like, what is this thing? I have to study it. But when Ayatollah Khomeini came into power, he inserted it into school curriculums, into Friday khutbahs, and he made it kind of really popularized it. And if you think about it a little bit, it was a very pragmatic move on his end. Because at this point, Iran and Iraq have had a 10-year war, and there's a demographic debacle. There are less men and there are more women, but you want the next generation. So he really promoted temporary marriage, and he said, like for women, it's good, you'll have children, for men, it's good, blah, blah, blah. And they really, in contemporary times, they really reinterpreted it to say that sexuality is a human need. And this human need exists both in men and women. And temporary marriage provides an avenue for that sexual need to be. So now, for example, I'm told that if you are at a university in Iran, in Tehran at least, you could cohabit with the opposite gender and say that you're in a temporary marriage and they can't do anything about that.
Okay, so an interesting talk to say the least. However, I come from the Shia and I come from the 12 and I heard about temporary marriage when I was very young. But what I also heard, and that's why I find your perspective very maybe one-sided, because my understanding of it is it's not really something practiced as a preferred option in today's day and age. There was a historical aspect of need, which you have alluded towards, that sex is a human need and it applies to both genders. And if there's consensuality in it, it should be allowed. The reason it has also attached certain obligations with the temporary marriage is, in some ways, I would interpret it as being empowered, not misusing a mere act in the wrong way. And that is why it is actually said. So there is a clause that you have to read something if you want to get into a sexual relationship. So it would be allowed. And in some ways, I would argue that it takes you away from prostitution and it gives you, you don't get carried away in an act. If you pause and then say, okay, if I'm getting carried away in this act, I'll pause, I will have, I mean, it's not a nikah, but you say a certain thing and then you proceed. So it actually forces you to come to a sanity, and it's not only physical emotion that is taking you to another level. So it is not used today. It was used in initial times when people were going for Hajj because a woman was not supposed to go alone, or when women were alone and considered vulnerable for protection. You needed to have it. So there are different viewpoints. I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. Uh, I think there are a lot of clause before people in today's day and age can go and do a muta. Misuse of any ruling is understandable. So I'm just wondering what your views on it is, because I just found it one-sided.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's take another question and then close the session. Here, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I will be brief. I know it's running late, and I just wanted to maybe put a comment and share a thought and then ask a question. Right? But I'll still be brief. So as a comment, I think as a Muslim who grew up in upstate New York, so I lived in New York for the most of my life since I was 2 years old. It's hard to find your Islamic guidance or religion. Just because you alluded to some institutions and organizations, they keep promoting their interpretation of what they think is the right Islamic way. And I think they fall into the same trap that they're accusing others of, which is this interpretation is not right, our interpretation is the one, and they sell it as this is a correct Islamic way, which the others is not. And that's why they're not widely accepted in at least my community, which I know I was part of. There's a lot of different religions. I guess the thought is, I think it would have been helpful, especially a comment for you since you work with this organization, which I believe they mean well. I believe they want to give guidance for that marginalized community in the U.S. It would be helpful to let them discuss it and put all the different opinions in the matter, and then make people make their own judgment based on their critical thinking. And then I'll go back to the last question, I guess. Both of you have mentioned Islamic law. And I just want to understand, what do you think that means? Because this term is often used, but it's not really available anywhere I could find in my personal research. So just to kind of understand, what do you mean by say Islamic law?
Thank you very much. I think I would get Dr. Akhtar and then.
I'll answer your question first, which is what do you mean by Islamic law? I think I and maybe many scholars think of Islamic law as trying to develop what was divine intent, what was the intention behind X, Y, and Z. And so we try to make laws according to that divine intent. So that's how I would answer it. In terms of the other question that, muta was something that was practiced historically and is not practiced now. You actually, it's come back into fashion. So it's not even that the Shia population are practicing muta, but Sunni population is also practicing muta. And for example, mosques in Germany will do muta marriages. And it is a thing that has come back. In terms of like, I'm not here to answer the question, is muta good or bad? I'm just using this as a space where I can think about sexual ethics.
I think it's interesting that you're framing it in this way, and I would say that the many Muslim feminist advocates and scholars that I have been studying over the past 20 years are in fact not doing that. They are not saying our interpretation is right and the other one, the patriarchal one, is wrong. That's always coming from patriarchal scholars, right? So the dismissal is always of feminist scholars precisely because, and that's true really for everyone I have studied, including Amina Wadud, who started out rather convinced that her reading of the Quran was better than other ones. And in Inside the Gender Jihad, her 2006 book basically says, I recognize that this is one of many readings and many interpretations. And so the work that I do, the academic the work that I do is basically looking at the ways in which that is a movement that has interpretive weight. I think it's also clear that no one, including Muslim feminists, will ever reach everyone. Okay? So I mean, I'm also really struck by you telling me what I should tell Hard to Grow in a sort of slightly patronizing and paternalistic way. I mean, we're told what to do all the time. Mhm.
What happens? So what? It's not to say this is the best or that's the answer. I wasn't talking for them or against them. What I'm saying is it's maybe, and that's why when I first started this, it's a thought. It's my thought. Very well could be wrong. That's not here. I'm not saying this is the right one, but I'm saying people have the ability to think for themselves. What I was saying is if people can put these thoughts and offer all the different interpretation and back up their own interpretation, and then make people decide, okay, I'm going to follow your interpretation or not. That's all I was saying.
So I think what's happening in the US is the exact opposite, right? So some people some Muslims want to think for themselves, and many Muslims are looking for someone who's giving them answers so that they are not responsible for those interpretations, right? So that sort of spectrum of possibilities, the Islamic knowledge in the plural, is something that is really anxiety inducing for a lot of Muslims, especially young Muslims. So I love the multiplicity of interpretations. I think that's why Islam has survived for so long. It's because in the pre-modern period, wallahu alam, right? Lots of different possibilities, and something that holds the whole thing together. So I think it might be helpful to talk about the Islamic law piece because I think that's connected, right? So the contemporary Muslim idea of what Islamic law is a really significant flattening of historical and pre-modern discourse because Islamic law is really, really complicated and didn't affect the vast majority of Muslims in the pre-modern period directly because they had nothing to do with it other than if they had a problem, right? And so contemporary Muslims are exposed to Islamic law, to fiqh, to jurisprudence in a way that's also really complicated. And they're often told by scholars who participate in this flattening of discourse what the right answer is. Okay? American Muslims, I've not done a survey, I don't do surveys, but the vast majority of American Muslims don't belong to a particular madhab because they don't even know that they are madhab. right? Like that's not even on their horizon. And so, and so this understanding of Islamic law as a living thing, the tradition as a living thing that changes constantly and is applied in a variety of ways around questions of authority, that's how I understand Islamic law. I'm also not entirely convinced that that works everywhere. I mean, I'm thinking about Turkey, where it's not involved in state law at all, and yet there is Islamic legal stuff happening. The US context is a very strange context for talking about law. So I don't know what you think Islamic law is, but I think it's much, much bigger and much, much more complicated than what people usually make it out to be. And then what we end up with is Quran and Sunnah Muslims, right? So we basically say, okay, law, fiqh, way too complicated. What does the Quran say about X? That's the starting question. And that creates a completely different Islam from in different places and for different Muslims.
Well, thank you very much. By this, we need to close. We got a sign. We have to close the session. Thank you very much, the audience and the speakers. Yeah, have a nice evening.